everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Brazilian Democracy Under Attack, 1964 and 2022. Today's event will be held in English and Portuguese with simultaneous translation to both languages. If you need to access translation, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to access your channel of reference. Many thanks to our interpreters, Glenda de la Fuente and Henrique Cotrim, for your hard work. So, para o nosso público no Brasil, cliquem no botão Interpretação na parte inferior de sua tela para acessar o canal de tradução simultânea para o português. My name is Sidney Chalubi. I'm the David and Peggy Rockefeller Professor of History and of African and Afro-American Studies at Harvard University. I will be your moderator today. This talk is being co-sponsored by our colleagues at the Future of Diplomacy Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, as well as the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. In 1964, a military coup d'etat supported by sectors of civil society inaugurated 2 decades of dictatorship in Brazil. In 2022, a right-wing government works to undermine democratic institutions and find justification for another period of authoritarianism. There is much in common in the political rhetoric used to attack democracy in both periods. Anti-democratic forces speak of political corruption, an alleged communist threat, the need to defend religious and moral values, etc. But the 2 historical moments are also in sharp contrast to each other. The purpose of this panel is to explore similarities and differences between 1964 and 2022, while history unfolds, and we witness whether Brazilian democracy will be able to avert, this time, a new moment of peril. So our speakers today, in the order that they will appear, will be first, James Green, who is the Carlos Manuel de Cespedes Professor of Modern Latin American History and Portuguese and Brazilian Studies at Brown University, where he's also director of the Brazil Initiative. He is currently director of the Opening the Archives Project, the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, and the president of the board of directors of the Washington, Brazil office. Next, we'll hear from Rodrigo Patto Motta, professor of Brazilian history at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and 1D researcher at CNPq, Conselho Nacional de Pesquisa in Brazil. His most recent book, which is particularly relevant for our discussion today, is called A Present Past, the Brazilian Military Dictatorship and the 1964 Coup. It was just published by Sussex Academic Press and Liverpool University Press. Lastly, but certainly not least, we will have the pleasure of hearing from Ana Flávia Magalhães Pinto, professor at the University of Brasilia. Her research seeks to articulate knowledge of the areas of history, communication, literature, and education, with an emphasis on political cultural performance of Black thinkers, Black press, abolitionism, as well as the experiences of Black freedom and citizenship in pre- and post-abolition Brazil and elsewhere in the African diaspora. We will record today's webinar, and it will be published on Dr. Class' YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We'll also email a link of the recording to all who registered. We hope to see you at other events that we host at the David Rockefeller Center for American Studies. In the chat, we've added links to our online calendar as well as social media channels. I encourage you to follow us there for the most up-to-date information on upcoming events. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question for our speakers, please send it through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of the session, but feel free to submit them at any time. So let's get down to work, beginning with Professor James Green. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. Jim, please.
Thank you, Sydney and Dr. Clarks, for organizing this event and having two really wonderful panelists sharing the time with me. Since I only have 10 minutes, I'm going to try to make 5 points. And if I don't finish all of them, I'll raise them in the question and answer if that's possible. So I think the first thing that to keep in mind is that, in 1964, Brazil was in the height of the Cold War with an international polarized world in which the United States supported authoritarian regimes in Latin America and elsewhere in the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution. And although in 2022, there's also a kind of international polarization that has not fully been elaborated and theorized, that is not, that is the far right authoritarian movements in the United States under Trump, Europe, most recently Sweden and Italy, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, Russia. And in some ways, there's a broad democratic front that Lula is constructing, which is, I think, an example at the forefront of the efforts to defeat these reactionary far-right forces, which has meant things like the unification of diverse political forces that have been traditionally adversaries, such as the party of the Brazilian Social Democracy. And I'm going to come back to that point in a minute or two. But the big difference, and this is really fundamental, is that in 1964, the U.S. government unconditionally supported the coup and implemented the Operation Brother Sam, a possible military intervention in the country that ended up not taking place, and then provided massive economic and military aid after the armed forces came to power. Whereas in 2022, the United States is on the other side of the battle. And this has been shown by Biden's very clear messages to the armed forces in Brazil and to Bolsonaro that if the democratic process is valid, the election process is legitimate, and then if there's any kind of military coup, then the United States will admonish it and perhaps even break ties with Brazil. And that's just a radically different situation. And I think it's most exemplified by the fact that Bernie Sanders, on the Wednesday before the first round of the elections, presented in the Senate a resolution basically calling for the ending of all economic and military to Brazil should the elections be challenged by the armed forces or by militias or by other forces. And it received unanimous consent. Any Republican could have blocked the resolution, but none of them chose to do so. And so this is, I think, a real sense of a dramatic difference between the two moments, and I think extremely important for averting a possible coup. Although I think that there is a possibility of political violence, possible mobilization of Bolsonaro's forces if he loses the elections to disrupt the outcome and question the results, but I think that if he will be unsuccessful, and I think people on this panel and Sydney might not agree with me, but this mobilization, much like Trump's big lie after the elections, questioning the results, if in fact Bolsonaro loses, will, I think, more be designed to show up his base of support and guarantee an ongoing political force of the far right in Brazil. So a second point I'd like to make is that the social forces that mobilized against João Goulart, the president at the time in 1964, to overthrow him and begin 21 years of military rule, was a very broad coalition that was composed, among other forces, by the majority of the Catholic Church, the majority of the middle classes, majority of entrepreneurs, the armed forces, the media, and other, in addition to the United States. And in 2022, there's ironically a much broader coalition that supports Lula, and reflects the fact that he has near majority support. But it's also a broad front composed of the left, the center, the moderate right, the major press, large sectors of the Catholic Church. 60% of Catholics support Lula versus 40% to Bolsonaro. And this is very significant, I think, because it really is very much different from the way in which Goulart was very unable to coalesce the forces sufficient to block the military overthrow in 1964. Now, the Brazil today is as polarized as it was in 1964, but I think the middle class is much more divided. The armed forces is muted, and the major difference is that the new political element that's come to play and have a very important role is the evangelical Christian churches, which represent 30% of the population, have been very active in mobilizing their support for the coup. Now, in this regard, moral values, as mentioned in the preface to this event, anti-communism, the defense of the family, continue to be important discourses. But and in a way, they reflect, in my mind, something that many historians have failed to recognize, which is Brazil in 1964 and in 2022 remains a country not just polarized, but actually divided by three main blocks: a conservative far right, conservative right-wing bloc of about 30% of the electorate, a centrist bloc, which in this moment has moved to the left to support Lula in large part, not entirely, and then the left, which represents another 30% of the population. And I think this polarization between these different political blocs around ideological issues, around questions of the family and moral values and anti-communism remain very, very important today. And so there's some kind of continuity, which I think has a much deeper root in Brazilian society that for many years, I think historians have kind of failed to see and understand fully. Another point, which I think is important to figure out, is that in 1964, 20 years after the defeat of Nazism and fascism, these two ideological movements were discredited and had very little support. It was only the fringe of the fringe that defended these perspectives. In 2022, we see a very strong semi-fascist, neo-fascist, or fascist movement, depending on how you want to characterize that. And although one could argue that this movement reorganized during the dictatorship and was represented to a certain extent by what we call the hard line, the Costa Silva and the Médici governments, and later those dissident sectors of the military that were responsible for the Rio Center bombing of 1981, they reorganized and articulated themselves. They were on the defensive, and because there was no punishment of the military, even though they withdrew for a period of time from visible political involvement, Bolsonaro opened the door in the campaign and then in his administration for a massive participation in the military, in his government, giving them many resources that they demanded, especially salary increases and extra bonuses for their work. And it's really brought them into the government in a way that never existed during the period prior to the end of the military dictatorship. In other words, in the period after the military dictatorship, the military didn't have the role that it has now. And finally, if we look at kinds of enemies of the past and the present, in 1964, it was the peasant leagues. And in 2022, in discourses of Bolsonaro, it's the MST, the Landless Peasants Movement. Ironically, the Northeast remains the enemy of the conservative forces in Brazil. The Northeast was going to explode in another revolution in 1964. And today, Lula has 60 to 70% popularity in all the states of the Northeast, and the Northeast has been demonized again by Bolsonaro more recently, and a very stupid political move on his part, but nevertheless, he's done that. The threats of revolutions remains imminent. The question of the Cuban Revolution 64, and now the Venezuelan, the Cuban, Nicaraguan, Chilean, and Colombian political forces, the leftist governments is being used as a demonizing force, much in a similar way. But ironically, when Bolsonaro called for, in this last week, for the increasing of the numbers of members on the Supreme Court, Global News, which represents kind of the centrist to the right political perspectives, which in this very moment are supporting Bolsonaro, really used the argument that this was going to make Brazil another Nicaragua, another Venezuela. In other words, making the argument that it's actually Bolsonaro who is carrying out anti-democratic movements that are similar to the ones that the center-right criticizes in the governments of Venezuela. And finally, as mentioned in the introduction, corruption remains a very important theme. It was one of the moving forces behind the movement that overthrew Goulart in '64, and there were a series of congressional investigative commissions that were established by colonels of the armed forces soon thereafter to look into the issues of corruption. Today, it remains a main theme. Of course, I think one of the largest obstacles that the Workers' Party has is the constant branding of Lula with corruption. And even though there's been an attempted counteroffensive pushing the same point to as Bolsonaro, it's been unsuccessful. And my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So we move to Professor Rodrigo Patto, please.
Well, I first would like to thank the invitation to participate in this panel, and also for the initiative to organize a debate on such a fundamental subject in view of the current context. Well, for some years now, I have been analyzing the connections between the 1964 coup and the recent context. I must clarify that by recent context, I mean the process that led to the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and to the rise of Bolsonarism. To discuss the connections between 1964 and the current period, I propose two paths of analysis, which will be explored next. The first path is a comparison or contrast between the two contexts to better understand them. An analytical operation that reveals the presence of structural elements. The second path is to reflect on the political manipulation of the recent past by today's far-right groups. I want to say that the presentation is based on the book just mentioned by Sydney and published in English 2 months ago, A Present Past, the Brazilian Military Dictatorship and the 1964 coup. So let's begin by analyzing some similarities between the 1964 context and the recent right-wing wave. The sensation that we are living an experience like 1964 arose during the 2014 elections, and especially in the first month of 2015, when large public demonstrations against President Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party took place. The events of 2014 and 2015 resembled the demonstrations that led to the military coup against President Goulart, especially the marches with God for Family and Freedom that took place in March and April 1964. On the other hand, on the one hand, the social actors present in both episodes are similar. Like I mentioned, James Green, I won't repeat that. In addition, during the demonstrations, the recent demonstrations, common banners were used against governments considered left-wing, which were also accused of corrupt practices. Besides the attacks on communism and corruption, those progressive governments were destabilized by moralistic and religious discourses on the grounds that they would be responsible or lenient to anti-Christian practices. Both in 1964 and today, far-right forces mobilized themes dear to a previous anti-communist tradition, whose essential elements associate the left with malignant images like foreigners, traitors, immorals, diseases, representations that on the extreme versions mention the devil itself. Well, I devoted my doctoral thesis on that, where I sought to analyze a Brazilian anti-communist tradition that was rooted between the 30s and the 60s. I just couldn't foresee that such tradition would be reappropriated again in the beginning of the 21st century. Well, that was the prevailing tone in the speeches that justified the 1964 military coup against Goulart and his allies. A similar mobilization took place from 2013 onwards, leading to Rousseff's impeachment and to the emergence of Jair Bolsonaro as a national leader. During the recent right-wing wave, Bolsonarism has grown by presenting itself as the champion against leftism or communism and corruption, which is true only in the first case. I mean, he's really an enemy of of the left, but not of corruption. Significantly, connections to the 1964 context were made explicit by current far-right activists who recovered some banners used in the 60s, like "Brazil will not be a new Cuba" or "Our flag will never be red," which suggests that their leaders spent time researching the archives. In any case, the fact that millions of people have embraced these ideas and images indicates the existence of a rooted anti-leftist tradition, especially among religious and military groups. This phenomenon is essential to understand the so-called anti-Petism, which has been manipulated by the far right to win support and votes. Therefore, the anti-communist tradition established in the first decades of the 20th century was reappropriated for the construction of the new anti-Petism, a phenomenon whose relevance was seen in Bolsonaro's victory in 2018 and again in the first round of the presidential election 2 weeks ago. However, there are differences between the conservative mobilizations of 1964 and the present ones. We'll mention only a few for lack of time. For example, changes in the figure of the foreign enemy, not Soviet Union no more, but Venezuela and Bolivarianism. Changes in the moralistic agenda. For instance, the current obsession of attacking the LGBT movement as if it had been created by the left. And a very important change, the rise of the neo-Pentecostal churches to a hegemonic position in the conservative religious field, while in the 20th century the Catholics occupy this place. Well, let's now develop the second part of my commentary, referring to the political use or misuse of the recent past by the far right. Unsurprisingly, one of the strategies has been to connect images of historical communism to PT, to the Workers' Party, and to Lula, to associate them with themes such as dictatorship, violence, and economic ruin. Likewise, another discursive line has been to link the Workers' Party to episodes of Brazilian history in which the issue of the red threat stood out. Bolsonaro did this during the election campaign when he referred to the years 1922, 1935, and 1964, suggesting that the nation was under threat once again and history could repeat itself with a new military coup, as we can deduce by his words. Although Bolsonaro's discourses mention other historical periods, the 1964 coup and the following dictatorship represents its core. First, because the 1964 coup brought a severe defeat to the left. Also, because 1964 implied a political regime dominated by the military, which is considered by Bolsonarism a golden age that is worth honoring and eventually reestablishing. In addition, some current left-wing leaders, such as Rousseff and Lula, participated in acts of resistance to the dictatorship, while Bolsonaro claims to have been a teenager seduced by the military career to fight the left-wing guerrillas. That's why that past is still present and why its history is so important to Bolsonarism, which manipulates it to make sense of its mission to defeat the left and to justify its political project. History occupies a central place in the culture war led by the ultra-right, which seeks to dominate the discourses about the past to build hegemony. That's why we see so many initiatives aimed at a kind of right-wing public history, both on the part of private groups, for example, the Brazil Paralelo group, and by the state itself, with policies like the militarization of public education. This strategy also explains the government's attacks on academic historiography, which is considered an obstacle and an enemy. It's no accident that Bolsonaro declared in a TV interview that historians should be forgotten. That is because he intends to convince people that 1964 was not a coup and that the military regime was not a dictatorship. The intention is to disseminate a softer picture of the military period in order to make the return of the armed forces to the political scene more acceptable. The denial that 1964 was a dictatorship also serves the discourse that the left would be intrinsically authoritarian, not the conservative right. And it's important to highlight that in the case of Brazil, such a belief contradicts history, as our country only faced right-wing dictatorships. Furthermore, the only two left-wing governments in Brazil, the ones led by Goulart and by PT, were democratic governments whose mandates were abruptly interrupted following noisy campaigns led by right-wing conservative forces. The fact that the Workers' Party first experience in government was interrupted by impeachment and not by a traditional coup reminds us that times have changed despite the similarities. Unlike the 60s, current conflicts will hardly lead to a classical dictatorship, among other reasons due to a lack of relevant international support, as commented by James Green. But that assumption is not to comfort us. If the far right win next October 30 elections, it is likely they will try to build a new kind of authoritarian regime. For example, by putting the judiciary and legislative branches under the control of the executive. It would be an authoritarian regime different from past dictatorships, but equally nefarious. If Bolsonarism wins a second term, it will certainly expand attacks on the university and academic system, which are one of its main targets, as they represent an obstacle to cultural hegemony plans. As a Bolsonarist businessman told me at an unpleasant and unlikely conversation in Buenos Aires 2 months ago, they need another 4 years to finish cleaning up the universities. This is one of the many reasons we have to defeat Bolsonarism, not only in the next elections, but in the next years. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. So now our last speaker, Ana Flávia Magalhães Pinto, please.
Thank you, colleagues, for sharing your ideas. When I said yes to Professor Sidney's invitation, I really wanted to believe that I would be able to think in English in this meeting. But the results of the first round of a Brazilian election some days ago forced me to think in my native language, Portuguese, for 24 hours a day, as Lélia Gonzalez said. So it was in this linguistic support that I prepared my speech today. So thank you for the translation to English, the other language, not my language. Em agosto de 1979, a revista Edição, título da imprensa negra gaúcha, lançado em 1978, publicou seu segundo número. A construção da capa demandou muito da criatividade de mulheres e homens da equipe de redação, que buscaram lidar com problemas incontornáveis, não apenas daquela conjuntura. Tratava-se de evidenciar o imperativo negligenciado por muitos. Falar sobre os destinos do Brasil seria necessariamente falar sobre as possibilidades de vida digna para a população negra e até mesmo indígena. As cores escolhidas para mobilizar o olhar do público foram vermelho, preto e branco. A imagem ao centro fazia referência a um amalá, comida sagrada em religiões de matriz africana dedicada a Xangô, o orixá da justiça. Acima dela foi colocado o texto de chamada. Democracia racial, lenta, gradual e relativa. A julgar pelo descompasso entre esses dois elementos principais da mensagem trabalhada naquele número, a imagem condensava antagonismos, tensões e dilemas nacionais que se fazem atuais. Justiça e injustiça estavam e estão postas em disputa. No final da década de 1970, tratava-se de uma confrontação direta ao modo como os presidentes militares Ernesto Geisel e João Figueiredo e seus aliados elaboravam a possibilidade de saída de uma ditadura que já durava 15 anos. O lema era abertura lenta, gradual e segura. Ao mesmo tempo, a revista Tição fazia alusão a jogos de poder herdados de outras épocas, algo a ser considerado até mesmo nos atuais debates sobre o bicentenário da independência brasileira, mas nem sempre feito. Entre uma efeméride que se construía, a anistia, e a outra já consolidada, a abolição, os acordos que se faziam para a saída dos militares coincidiam com os ecos das celebrações dos 90 anos do fim da legalidade da escravidão no Brasil. Nelas, a gente negra, quando muito, figurava na condição de problema social, uma pedra no caminho do progresso da nação. Portanto, a maneira de lidar com um evento servia de referência para a condução de outro. Não por acaso, os significados desses usos da memória foram ainda mais explorados no editorial intitulado Abolição Lenta, Gradual e Relativa. Na avaliação emitida pela revista, a democracia racial brasileira é tão verdadeira quanto esta outra que prometem vai vigorar em breve, de forma lenta, gradual e relativa. Aos 90 anos de abolição, somam-se 4 séculos de saques ao continente negro e de uso do braço negro e de seus descendentes para a produção da riqueza das classes dominantes brancas. Mais adiante, uma outra parte do argumento explorava as consequências da negação do problema. Ao negar-se a existência da discriminação racial, de preconceito de cor e da especificidade de uma luta de libertação do negro, priva-se uma imensa maioria da população brasileira do entendimento e da resolução dos seus próprios conflitos. Antes de brasileiros, há um ser humano oprimido, racialmente inferiorizado pela herança escrava. Além de estabelecer um ponto de partida mais recuado para a reflexão, a equipe editorial da revista Tição estava comprometida com o melhor dimensionamento do estrago feito, mediante a negação e a naturalização do racismo. Eu poderia ainda selecionar outros trechos deste e de outros títulos da imprensa negra publicados nos chamados Anos de Chumbo brasileiros. Mas eu optei apenas por esses dois, por me parecerem suficientes para sustentar um salto, ou melhor, uma ponte com os dias atuais e trazer algumas questões para o centro da nossa reflexão sobre a democracia brasileira sob ataque. Ponto número 1. Se considerarmos apenas as últimas 5 ou 6 décadas, o avanço do desmonte do mito da democracia racial, protagonizado por intelectuais ativistas negras e negros, tem viabilizado a percepção do movimento negro como sujeito político estratégico de promoção da cidadania no Brasil. Ponto número 2. Ao contrário da imagem dos vazios entre uma iniciativa coletiva e outra protagonizada por gente negra, pesquisadoras e pesquisadores de todo o país e fora dele têm evidenciado uma permanência de lutas e denúncia do preconceito de cor ou do racismo, que antecedem até mesmo o marco fundador da nacionalidade brasileira e que nos obriga a pensar democracia como algo que não deve ser considerado sem a atenta percepção dos sujeitos históricos que compõem essa sociedade. E 3, na condição de sujeitos permanentes e com agendas próprias, indivíduos e coletividades negras não podem mais ser previstas em análises críticas apenas como corpos a colorir espaços políticos pensados a priori como brancos. Ou seja, não se pode pensar a presença negra na história das lutas por democracia no Brasil tão somente como uma figurinha dourada, excepcional, num álbum organizado a partir dos critérios que serviram para pavimentar o protagonismo das elites brancas, masculinas, concentradoras de renda e heteronormativas como expressão, por excelência, de sujeitos históricos. E, por fim, 4, e de tal sorte, é preciso verticalizar em nossas análises uma constatação vocalizada pela coalizão negra por direitos. Enquanto houver racismo, não haverá democracia. Por ocasião do lançamento do livro A Resistência Negra ao Projeto de Exclusão Racial, Brasil 200 anos, organizado pelo Dr. Hélio Santos, comentei que no maior país negro fora do continente africano, o certo seria que as demandas dos homens e das mulheres que compõem esse segmento negro majoritário fossem encaradas com a máxima seriedade. Mas a falta de um acerto de contas justo com o passado presente escravista e racista não deixa. A negação do racismo como estruturante das desigualdades sociais segue autorizando o não cumprimento de promessas de cidadania iniciadas há 2 séculos, colocando, inclusive, em risco a viabilidade de qualquer projeto de democracia e exercício efetivo de direitos civis, sociais e políticos. A relativização dos dados que caracterizam o cenário de genocídio da juventude negra impede até mesmo a formulação de uma política de segurança pública pautada no direito à vida. Direitos civis, políticos e sociais são cotidianamente violados, mas há quem diga mesmo assim que a democracia está assegurada. Não tenho dúvida que a nossa democracia de baixa intensidade, como qualificada por Sueli Carneiro, está em absoluto risco. E por isso estamos, em todos os lugares que ocupamos, em luta, como acadêmicos, como ativistas, como mulheres, pessoas negras, pessoas LGBTQIA+, como cidadãos. Mas penso ser bastante perigoso também que as análises do nosso campo progressista sigam fazendo projeções de saída para esse momento, passando batido ou subestimando dados como os captados, na verdade, já consolidados em outras eleições, né? E também captados nas recentes pesquisas de intenção de votos, que não estão num descontínuo com os dados já consolidados, a exemplo da pesquisa divulgada pelo IPEC no dia 10 de outubro. Né? Os dados confirmam um apoio majoritário da população negra e não branca a Lula, 57% entre os que se autodeclaram pretos e pardos. Entre os autodeclarados brancos, seriam 44%. Articulada a outras variáveis como região, religião, gênero e renda, o pertencimento racial tem sido determinante do agravamento da vulnerabilidade no que diz respeito à violência política, daqueles que pleiteiam, são eleitos e têm seus mandatos colocados à prova, em risco, e também a nós, cidadãos e cidadãs brasileiros, que acreditamos que estamos elegendo, estamos disputando projetos de Brasil de democracia. Isso, aliás, me parece um aspecto muito importante para nos prepararmos para, a despeito do que vem acontecer, né, no final do mês de outubro, para promover a defesa de mandatos de pessoas negras, mulheres, LGBTQIA+, tanto no legislativo quanto no executivo. Não podemos desconsiderar que, a despeito do resultado, a nossa democracia, os nossos sonhos de democracia, seguirão em risco por um período que, como historiadora, não sou capaz de calcular, mas absolutamente tenho a certeza de que a ação de sujeitos no presente é que determina qualquer possibilidade de futuro. E isso implica nos comprometer, né, e nos até mesmo nos contestar, nos questionar como historiadoras e historiadores e, enfim, cientistas das áreas das ciências humanas. Obrigada.
Thank you, Ana Flávia. So while people warm up to ask questions, let me ask a question. One of them is to James and Rodrigo, and then I'll ask another one to Ana Flávia. The first one is actually a question. There is a Gabriela Alvarez sends a question. How do you evaluate the explicit sponsorship of Lula to Maduro's presidential campaign in a video recorded in 2014? At that time, there were already enough proofs, footage, pictures of the violation of human rights of Chavez's government. This is a question to both James and Rodrigo. I think there are many people who support Lula and the left in Brazil have been not comfortable, have not been comfortable with these frequent, and there is a recent event several months ago repeating this kind of situation in which the Workers' Party seems to be supporting leftist dictatorships in Latin America. This is always an issue that comes back. It's thrown at the Workers' Party all the time. And I keep wondering whether it's not about time to sever relations with this type of government for good, considering that the leftist parties in Brazil and the Workers' Party specifically have been consistently democratic and have been really defending democracy so strongly that it seems very contradictory to have any tolerance with this type of governments in the rest of America. So what do you say to this?
Do you want me to start? Or do you want to
Anybody,
start?
you
Okay.
or Rodrigo?
So the fact of the matter is, there is a sector within the core of the Workers' Party that still sees certain regimes, especially Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, as part of a progressive camp. And they have that position and they have that influence. My sense is that Lula has been always a pragmatic person, and because he's built a broad coalition, including what we used to call center-right, which are center-right political forces into that coalition to govern, that I think he will steer clear of overt support for the Nicaraguan and the Venezuelan regimes. I think Cuba's it's much more complex, because the left argue that the embargo against Cuba, the ongoing attacks of the United States, demand that Cuba be defended. But I think that's something that's going to be debated, and if Lula is elected, It will be part of the debates of the next 4 years, and it will depend largely on two elements: who Lula chooses to be the Minister of Foreign Relations or Chancellor, and also what is his real strategic policies towards the global South, which he's articulated he intends to strengthen, which then means building broad coalitions internationally against Northern global hegemony, which implies strategic or tactical alliances with our parties, governments that might not be considered democratic. I have my personal opinions on this, but I'm not going to present them. I'm doing an analysis. So I don't know.
Well,
Rodrigo.
I don't know if I have anything different to say from what James just remarked. I just believe that most important as a Brazilian citizen is to observe the Workers' Party in government. As already mentioned, they govern Brazil in a democratic way. I believe that we had this strategic moment at the end of Lula's second term, when Lula was so popular that some of his followers, a few group, suggested a third mandate, a third term. Someone suggested to make an amendment in the constitution to allow for that. And at that moment, lots of people would accept, and millions would vote on Lula. And Lula said, no, we will not do that. So in this strategic moment, we saw that Lula and PT's project is not any kind of dictatorship. And I believe that the way they wave towards Venezuela or Nicaragua, it's as James just said, it has to do with internal conflicts inside PT, and Lula, I believe he uses that to wave to the left-wing fringe of PT. I believe as a citizen, they should discuss that, and more than that, the most important thing for me is that PT should better clarify its ideological purposes and projects. Many people believe that PT is a kind of socialist party. I don't think that. I believe that PT is a kind of social democratic party, like the European ones, like the Labour Party in Britain. And I believe that making people use the idea that PT is a kind of socialist party is not helpful to clarify the political debate in Brazil. And as socialist, I mean a party oriented towards the end of private property and building some kind of socialist property. I don't think that that's the project of PT, of the most part of PT. And I think this should be clarified. That said, it's important to clarify for the people that are listening to us that this kind of discussion is used by the ultra-rights to say that PT is a menace, PT is communist, and it looks for a dictatorship. And as I said in my presentation, in Brazil, this is really a deceptive argument, because in Brazil, we only knew and only know right-wing dictatorships. We never had a left-wing dictatorship. Left people that came to power governed in democratic ways. And I think that as citizens, we should say, take care about the right, about the ultra right, because they had built dictatorships before, and they could do that again. But these days, the liberal, neoliberal press in Brazil is saying that Bolsonaro, that always said he hates Venezuela, is acting like the Venezuelan regime when he manages to control the judiciary power. So the real menace, when we talk about dictatorship in Brazil, is not the left, is the right wing that menaces us to go back to dictatorship.
Thank you, Jim and Rodrigo. And Flávia, would you say a little more about the idea of low-intensity democracy that Sueli Carneiro put forward, because I do remember that during the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, people like Sueli Carneiro and Jama Werneck were all very much denouncing the impeachment as a coup and as a coup against Black people, but they were also very critical of the Workers' Party's government. And I think that had to do with their idea that whatever democratic values inform the left when they are in government, it is values that have to do with a low intensity democracy. And could you expand a little more? I think it's good for our listeners and to us to think about what it means, because also if Lula wins, I don't know if you can dream of having anything but, again, a low intensity democracy, given the political forces that are in Congress these days. So can you develop this a little more to us?
Eu comecei já a pensar em inglês, mas não vou em inglês, eu vou em português. Estava em inglês aqui. Sorry. As pessoas tendem a localizar a experiência de cidadania, de disputa por democracia para a população negra no Brasil, somente no pós-abolição. E isso ainda muito recentemente, porque nem mesmo isso era garantido. Isso aponta para uma experiência antidemocrática muito profunda, muito grave. De todo modo, quando Sueli Carneiro fala em precisamos restituir a nossa democracia de baixa intensidade, é porque trata-se de pelo menos estar num campo em que os jogadores ainda têm alguma chance de preservação da própria existência. Porque a confrontação aos limites dessa cidadania ainda seguem viabilizados. E nisso, Sueli Carneiro não está falando dos 200 anos de cidadania do Brasil. Sueli Carneiro está se referindo ao que foi conquistado no processo das disputas pela redemocratização. Algo que foi, sim, construído por diferentes sujeitos. Sujeitos esses que, inclusive, têm atuado para que a esquerda se mantenha à esquerda, no que diz respeito ao compromisso com a justiça social, né, enfrentamento ao monopólio de terra, de educação, da comunicação, da saúde, enfim, todos os direitos, e, sobretudo, não só direitos, mais do que direitos civis, mas, sobretudo, direitos sociais e políticos. Isso faz com que intelectuais como Sueli Carneiro, Jurema Werneck, Edson Cardoso, Hélio Santos, né, tenham acumulado ao longo dessas últimas décadas, né, ao longo de suas trajetórias, uma capacidade de analisar o Brasil não por meio de dicotomias, de polarizações simplificadas, porque, ao considerar essa leitura sobre uma democracia de baixa intensidade desde a perspectiva da população negra, esses sujeitos estão analisando como que indivíduos pouco inteligíveis para matrizes de análises consolidadas, hegemonizadas, né? Eles aparecem de uma maneira mais sofisticada. E essa sofisticação se dá, inclusive, pelo fato de que não é possível fazer leituras por exemplo, dessa população evangélica, né, cristã, como se ela não fosse interpelada por uma experiência racial, de gênero, de classe, né, e regional. Nesse sentido, não há uma tradição crítica entre o movimento negro de não se fazer antagonista da esquerda, né? Mas de até mesmo garantir essas promessas que são antigas e que antecedem até mesmo a fundação do PT, né? Em 70, em 80, enfim, esse contexto aí que antecedem até mesmo a consolidação do partido, né? Mas em termos assim conceituais, eu acho muito valioso que a gente perceba o tão pouco que nós temos para não cair em ciladas, né? Como a que está no nosso horizonte, né? Temos uma composição no legislativo bastante preocupante? Temos, mas é preciso pensar que a defesa dessa democracia de baixa intensidade será feita por uma quantidade de deputados que são formados a partir desse movimento social que enxerga o Brasil com maior sofisticação, como nunca antes nós tivemos nesse país. São sujeitos que foram formados politicamente não para colocar essa complexidade da experiência brasileira debaixo do tapete e tentar reaplicar modelos já estabelecidos. Então, nesse sentido, nós temos ali, talvez pela a minha insistência em não jogar a toalha, nós temos uma oportunidade incrível, né, de tensionar o Brasil a se enxergar nas suas mazelas, como talvez em outros momentos a gente não tenha tido. E um sintoma disso, né, me parece ser justamente a viabilidade da construção de eleições, como a do Renato Freitas, como deputado estadual no Paraná, a eleição de Érica Hilton, deputada federal por São Paulo, a eleição do pastor Henrique Vieira como deputado federal pelo Rio de Janeiro, né? E fora outras que a gente não vai ter condição de falar todas elas aqui, mas é importante que se acompanhe a viabilidade, né, da defesa dos parlamentares eleitos no quilombo nos parlamentos nos próximos anos. Assim a gente vai poder entender a viabilidade ou não, né, da retomada do que Sueli Carneiro chama de democracia de baixa intensidade no Brasil, porque ainda estamos no início desse jogo.
Thank you, Ana Flávia. This was a very interesting explanation of the different perspectives about democracy from the Black movement in relation to the Brazilian left. I think that was a wonderful explanation. So there are several questions here. I think I have two questions that probably one can be addressed perhaps mostly by Jim and the other one by Rodrigo. Jim, Alair Brito, who is a Brazilian who majored in political science, international studies in Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, he asks a question that I think you are the best person to answer probably because you have written a whole book about this. It is a fact that the U.S. had a huge influence in the 1964 coup in Brazil in order to stop communism in Latin American countries. I'd like to hear from you, how is the U.S. facing the possibility of a left-wing party returning to power in Brazil, which is a reality in many other Latin American countries at the moment? What are your thoughts on that? So comparing the U.S., you did a little of that in your talk already, but then you can maybe develop a little more. And to Rodrigo, well, it's a question asking historians to think about the future. We are not very good at this, but you can try. Going forward, there's a question from Paulo Carvão. Going forward, what do you view as the viable alternatives for the center left in Brazil after the implosion of the PSDB? Well, I don't know, calling PSDB the center left is maybe 30 years ago. It has been right as center right in the past decades, and even that right and center right we now miss. So who are the emerging leaders in this area? What is the alternative? So,
Yeah, so
Jim, please, first.
Let me just first mention something that's important. A very prominent Brazilian historian contacted me, and I then contacted Barbara Weinstein in 2018 to ask us to write an open letter to social scientists, encouraging them to convince Fernando Cardoso to support Haddad in the elections. And we wrote a letter, we circulated it, we got 22 prominent social scientists who had worked with Cardoso, and then he remained silent when we sent it to him. Nothing happened. And what's significant is that I think, even though Cardoso knew exactly who Bolsonaro was, the political situation has changed such that there's an incredibly broad front that is supporting Lula's candidacy against Bolsonaro. And as was pointed out, it kind of helped explode the PSDB. And I have a lot to say about that, but I just wanted to acknowledge this historian's really wonderful work in that regard. And actually the long-term results of that effort that didn't work out in 18. But regarding the US involvement, I mean, the United States has many interests in Brazil that run in conflict with what possibly will be the Lula government. They have interests about Chinese influence in Brazil, about 5G, about trade policies, about competition with other parts of the world in terms of their influence over Brazil. But on one thing, they have been very consistent. And I don't think anyone can read it any other way, which is that Biden, the CIA, the Defense Department, and Congress are all first believing in the elections and are pledged to recognize the outcome. And let's hope the outcome is one in which, if the United States supports it, it's a positive thing. But they're very consistent about that. And I think even if Bolsonaro mobilizes his forces, if he loses by a small margin or a large margin, I'm assuming that the leaders of Europe and Biden will, after the Federal Election Commission, the TSE, has recognized the results, will immediately congratulate Lula. And they've had this policy since the beginning of the campaign, when all the polls from the very beginning, not a single one that's credible has said anything other than the fact that Lula's going to win. So they understand that recognizing the election results and being against a coup means not supporting Bolsonaro and supporting Lula should he win the elections. And I think there are many reasons for that, but I think the biggest one is the trauma that Trump has created in the United States within the Democratic Party, and the fact that Bolsonaro and Trump are so close, and Trump endorsed Bolsonaro in this election illegally, and that the Democratic Party does not want another ally in Latin America of the far right. That's in power. They prefer a government of the center left. And Lula was able to do that. He seduced George W. Bush, Jr., and he was impressive towards Obama at a certain moment and called the man. And then there were some problems with the relationship between the two countries. But I think the United States is aware of that and is willing to deal with that, prefers to deal with that, even though they're going to use a lot of influence to change or to pressure Brazil on certain policy issues. I think they're really clear on this. And that's really a significant change. And it's partially because of the broad coalition that's been built nationally and internationally against Bolsonaro.
Thank you, Jim. Rodrigo, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure if PSDB is center-left. I would say it's a kind of democratic neoliberal party. It's hard to say what will be the future. Right now, PSDB is almost dead. And it has to do with the Bolsonarism growing over the former supporters of PSDB. This is very clear in case of São Paulo, for instance. And Bolsonarism, the strength of Bolsonarism is based on its ability to attract the middle classes, the people that used to vote for center parties like PSDB, and most of these people are now supporting Bolsonaro. So I believe that the first thing is to defeat Bolsonaro in order to try to rebuild a center in Brazil, a center party in Brazil. Maybe that will occur in case of PT's victory, because I think that part of this big front that supports Lula today will split from PT in the next month and years, and maybe they will create a center party again, a center movement that maybe could be based on a coalition between PSDB and Simone Tebet's MDB. They are very close. And Tebet is a leadership that probably will grow a lot in the next years, because she's a clever woman, a woman with well, democratic views. Although she's a big farmer, she's connected to the agro business in Brazil. So anyway, I guess that maybe people that doesn't live in Brazil can't understand that, but everything is about defeating Bolsonaro. Everything depends on that. After the defeat of Bolsonaro, things will clear out, changes will come. We are not sure about Lula's government, what he will be able to do. But anyway, anything is better than what we have now. We are really in front of an abyss, and it's really necessary, because as James Green says about this big front surrounding Lula, it's really impressive. I was in the March demonstration we held here in Belo Horizonte last Sunday, a huge manifestation of people, and I saw there leaders of PSDB, leaders of the old Communist Party that never supported PT, and they were there supporting Lula. It's really, well, in a way, it's nice to see that people really responsible, people that really try to save democracy in Brazil are now in a kind of well, humble attitude supporting Lula. If this big front is defeated by Bolsonaro, it will be the end of the Brazilian low democracy that we are building since the 70s and 80s, because every leader and party that supported the democratization in the 80s are now supporting Lula. So if all these groups are defeated in an election, this will be the end of the so-called democracy we had based on the 1988 constitution. So there's a lot at stake right now. And I'm really concentrated in Bolsonaro's defeat to think about the future the next day.
Okay, just a question just came in to Flávia from Stephanie Ramos Acosta. I'd like to ask Professor Ana Flávia Magalhães what left and center-left parties have to learn from the strategies of the Black social movements. What they have to learn from the struggles of the Black social movements, such as Quilombo dos Parlamentos and the Black intellectuals. Ana Flávia, can I ask you another thing which is just related to this to some extent, maybe? Despite all the initiatives that have happened in the past few years, women and people of African descent continue to be a very small minority in Brazilian politics. And whatever small minority they have, these ones are unequally threatened by violence, by the right wing, and so on. So I wonder if, I know this is now a long shot, it's not achievable in the short term, but the same was the case with affirmative action at the universities, and eventually you pushed it until you got it. Shouldn't we have a parliament with a strict quota system to guarantee that women and people of African descent will be represented in Brazilian politics, the same in ways that are coherent with the demographics of the country?
Thank you for your questions. It's so crazy because
Ana Flávia, pode ir em português. You can go in Portuguese if you wish.
Às vezes, enfim, o contexto faz a luta. Antes de mais nada, eu acho válido a gente refletir sobre as mudanças que estão em curso. Porque, diante dessa sensação de uma avalanche conservadora, a gente tem meio que alimentado a sensação de que houve uma estagnação de um processo de revisão, de acerto de contas do Brasil consigo mesmo, né? Talvez a intensidade desse avanço conservador, né, seja resultado de um adensamento dessa ampliação da ideia de cidadania, da ideia de participação social que nós estejamos experimentando. E, por óbvio, isso não vai ficar muito evidente logo de cara na composição desses espaços institucionais. Então, à medida dessas experiências, eu acho que elas não devem, a medida não deve ser priorizada pelo quantitativo desses sujeitos nos espaços. Porque, já respondendo, então, a pergunta da Stephanie, o que há que se aprender com essas experiências como Quilombo dos Parlamentos, né, e outras iniciativas como Mulheres Negras Decidem, iniciativas, inclusive, de formação de candidaturas, né? Pela primeira vez na história desse país, né, nós, pelo menos na história recente, nós tivemos um investimento de formação política de candidaturas. Porque um dos grandes desafios para o enfrentamento à desigualdade racial no Brasil é, inclusive, a percepção de que é um assunto para ser debatido amplamente e constantemente. Isso até mesmo por políticos e políticas negras, né? Parlamentares, gestores, etc. Nesse contexto, é importante que outros setores que estão construindo a política no Brasil entendam que o trato do problema racial, ele não se dá tão somente com a inclusão de pessoas negras em peças prioritárias, né, no levantamento de um conjunto de artistas, né, a fazer uma defesa, mas até mesmo em como, né, a própria política vai ter que ser repensada. Acho que, para mim, é um dos principais ensinamentos, né, que essas iniciativas do movimento negro podem dar aos outros campos da política brasileira. No que diz respeito aos desafios dessa expansão, obviamente, nós já percebemos que a estratégia de incentivo via fundo eleitoral, ela não vai surtir efeito se não houver um enfrentamento tal qual já se verificou e tem se verificado, né, na condução das políticas de ações afirmativas para ingresso nas universidades e nos concursos públicos. Porque há fraude, crimes estão sendo cometidos, e nessa eleição, isso nem mesmo, até o momento que a gente está aqui, isso não gerou impugnação por falsidade ideológica, e muitas vezes isso não aconteceu, né, nas experiências anteriores, no que diz respeito à educação superior, a concursos públicos. Existe uma postura muito condescendente com crimes cometidos contra direitos de pessoas negras no Brasil. E talvez nós ainda não estejamos preparados para lidar com que posturas esse país precisa tomar para inviabilizar essa violação. Nós que gostamos muito do século XIX, sabemos muito bem como essa tradição se constitui. a despeito de todas as promessas de cidadania na Constituição de 1824, que não eram muitas, que não eram totais, é preciso dizer, as violações, elas se tornaram costume, de modo que uma pessoa negra tinha que se provar livre, porque a presunção era de que ela fosse escravizada. O contrário não acontecia. A possibilidade de se punir escravistas, violadores da liberdade, da cidadania de pessoas negras, isso foi muito bem apaziguado. E seguiu sendo apaziguado, haja vista as 51 mil casos de pessoas submetidas à escravidão contemporânea que foram identificados de 1995 para cá. Então, eu acho muito curioso, respondendo aí, já concluindo, que a gente ainda acredite que está fazendo defesa das instituições democráticas sem nomear, tipificar, quantificar e qualificar as violações de direitos que têm sido cometidos contra pessoas negras e indígenas nesse país. Porque parece, sem considerar isso, parece realmente que as instituições estão funcionando corretamente, estão asseguradas. Não estão. Quando a gente pega os dados da violência política, eu insisto em falar sobre isso, porque isso vai dar a medida, né, de até mesmo ser possível ou não que os diferentes setores, né, os segmentos da esquerda, do centro e talvez até de parte da direita, né, consigam assegurar nos próximos anos o restabelecimento daquilo, né, que a gente falou anteriormente, que é a democracia brasileira de baixa intensidade. Algo que nos permita sonhar com algo mais denso, mas que até mesmo isso está em sérios riscos quando a gente considera, né, até mesmo a dificuldade de nós, esse campo que está confrontando isso que pode ser chamado como fascismo, como projetos de supremacia, né, de destruição do meio ambiente, né? E a gente não pode levar adiante o debate em que tanto o vocabulário como a gramática da barbárie seja explicitado, porque em alguma medida nós vamos nos ver implicados, sendo cúmplices, conscientes disso ou não.
Okay, Rafael, thank you. I think we can, if Thiago allows us, 1 minute to each one of you for closing remarks. And well, I was going to read Camila Franca's question, which she wanted us to speculate about how much damage Bolsonaro would be able to make if he won again. And I'm going to take her question upside down and ask you for a minute of reflection of what would be ahead of us, what are the challenges if Lula wins and he has to deal with the Bolsonaro legacy beginning next year. So 1 minute, let's finish on a positive tone. Let's suppose we survive. Democracy is still there, but there is still a huge challenge ahead of us. And so 1 minute to say, what would you look for in a government that after Brazilian democracy is saved and Lula is the president? What would you like to see? 1 minute, closing remarks, please. Tim, you start.
Well, I'll be positive in a relative sense, because I think what Ana Flávia says is absolutely right, because the question is, the government of Lula will face all of the economic problems, all of the things that have been created by Bolsonaro to win the elections, which are going to destroy the budget of the country. And all of the commitments he's making, not just to the social movements and sectors that have mobilized to support him, but also to his new allies in this broad coalition. It's going to be the most difficult government ever conceived, I think, in the history of the country, as this election is the most important election. And it's going to be very difficult for him to respond. I mean, Lula in the last I think the most beautiful thing that Lula said in the last debate on global was his commitment to use the word reparations in the context of the genocide against African Brazilians, and understand that in a question that was asked to him. It was, I think, one of the best moments, I think, in that debate. But that's a relative thing in the sense of the difficulty of really carrying out a program with all the challenges it's going to face. So I think that the challenge in the future is going to be to support the progressive measures of the government that come to power, and outside the government push for it to go further than it's wanting to do or capable of doing, and then recognize that tension in this regard.
Rodrigo,
Well,
please.
I hope that Lula will be able to keep this broad coalition surrounding him to help him face the first month, inclusively because of the ultra-right likely reaction against Lula's victory. So he will be able to keep this coalition beside him for at least a few months or years, and be able to build an economic program capable of offering economic growth, because that in Brazil is really an important political issue, economic growth. And also, I would like Lula's government to this time be more harsh towards the military. I think it's really necessary in Brazil to educate the military forces that they are not more wanted as a political actor. Brazil needs military people prepared for international wars or defense of our frontiers, but we don't need them as political actors. And many military leaders believe they are necessary. And I think it's important for the next government to convince them they are not. And I think this involves the question of the military regime history. The military should be taught that what they did in the 60s and 70s is not anything we should appraise them or thank them, because they produced economic growth, but at a high social cost and political violence and retraction of democracy. So I think this is an important issue, because it's difficult to understand Bolsonaro's rise to power without facing that the military were beside and behind Bolsonaro, helping him to scale. So I think this is a strategic issue. If Lula wins with a slow margin of votes, of course, this will be more hard to do, because he needs political support to do that. But I hope this time he will be more brave, because in his first term in power, he was not willing to face the military and to get in shock with them. And I believe that seeing this past from today, it was a mistake. If at that time Lula faced the military in another way, maybe we were not in this situation right now. Anyway, I hope we are going to win, inclusively because of our universities and scientific, everything in Brazil depends on that. The Black people, Native people. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. So, Ana Flávia, 1 minute. We are much beyond the time. So, yeah, just 1 minute, please.
Bem, o que esperar? Não espero nada. Só tenho uma certeza: a luta continua. E a luta continua porque aquilo que, inclusive, serve como repertório, recurso, exemplo para justificar uma nova eleição de Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, é resultado dessas lutas que os sujeitos políticos, em sua variedade no Brasil, têm travado. Porque se a gente considerar que, em termos de educação, aquilo que é apresentado como vantagem em relação a Bolsonaro é resultado das lutas pela democratização, universalização da educação básica e ampliação do ensino superior, isso é resultado de tensionamentos de vários grupos. saúde, a possibilidade de termos um parâmetro mais positivo de atuação do SUS no enfrentamento a epidemias é resultado das lutas de grupos em defesa da saúde pública. A habitação, a retomada de um projeto como Minha Casa Minha Vida e outros programas de acesso à casa própria é resultado das lutas históricas por habitação nesse país. Segurança, né, é algo que a gente tem como problema, mas a segurança alimentar é algo que serve de referência muito positiva para confrontar a ação desse governo Bolsonaro em 4 anos. Por fim, tem também a questão dos direitos trabalhistas, né? O fato de que houve um esforço para equacionar a condição de sujeitos, de trabalhadores com direitos, inclusive para trabalhadoras e trabalhadores domésticos, é algo que diz respeito a essa série de ações que demonstram que, ao continuar, a luta gera saldos, e não só saldos da reserva dos recursos externos, que seguram ainda até hoje, mas existe um capital humano sendo defendido e projetado, e que demonstra que aquilo que faltou, né, é o que demanda justamente a nossa ação e não a nossa expectativa, né? Então, eu vou mais com todo o pique do esperançar do Paulo Freire, né, que me obriga a agir sistematicamente em todos os espaços em que não só eu, mas todos nós estivermos nos próximos 4, 8, 12. Eu sendo pirracenta, né, eu projeto aí uma luta de 12 a 16 anos para confrontar o bolsonarismo. Talvez, porque eu quero estar ainda com saúde, né, com disposição para curtir essa resolução, essa ampliação de cidadania. Por isso que eu projeto em 16 anos. Talvez a gente gaste mais, mas é importante que a gente construa possibilidades para isso na luta.
Thank you. I think this is just a perfect key for us to end. So we hope for the best on October 30th, but whatever happens, a luta continua. So thank you all for the panel, and let's all hope for the best in the next few weeks. See you next time. Bye-bye.